Hey, Jonathan, just testing our volume.
Good. You sound good. Susie, can you hear me?
So I'm going to give us another moment of wait bot, but I couldn't quite hear you. I just wanted you to hear me.
Okay, I can hear you just fine now.
It's no secret. It's plain to see. I love you, and you love me. It's no secret. You know it's true. You love me, and I love you. The only time we seem to meet is in the middle of the night. Only then can I feel your heartbeat. Till something's not right. Together I see you and me, always and all time.
Hello, hello, hello. This is Susie McMahon with Tales from the Lowcountry with my very first show, and I have such a good friend that has decided to join me tonight for this new experience, and we promise we'll do it again with video and all the bells and whistles. But tonight, I just wanted to introduce Tales from the Lowcountry that I'm starting off after being on Fireside for over a year and trying to come up with the actual platform or what I was going to do because I have a pretty darn unique virtual book club. And tonight I have a author, a publicist, a publisher, all rolled into one. And Jonathan Haupt, welcome to Fireside. Can you say hi to everyone?
Thanks so much, Susie. It's a real pleasure to be here and help you test drive your new show tonight. And it's always fun to talk to you, too. So I really appreciate being invited as your first guest.
Thank you so much. And just so everybody knows, a lot of people say, what is the Low Country? And it's a geographical area, but it's also a whole lot more than that. I'm sitting in Beaufort, South Carolina, probably just a few miles away from Jonathan. And I'd like to introduce him to everyone before we start our conversation. Jonathan Haupt is the executive director of the nonprofit Conroy Center and the former director of the University of South Carolina Press, where he created the Story River Books fiction imprint with Pat Conroy, named by Garden and Gun magazine as one of the top 10 things to love about the South. His book reviews and author reviews have appeared in the Charleston Post and Courier, Lowcountry Weekly, Beaufort Lifestyle, Savannah Morning News, Beacon Magazine, Southern Review of Books, and Southern Writer Magazine Sweet Tea Blog. He is the co-editor of the anthology Our Prince of Scribes. Writers remember Pat Conroy. That book is the recipient of 17 book awards. He serves on the board of Friends of South Carolina Libraries and the South Carolina Academy of Authors. In 2020, Haupt was recognized with the Doug Marlette Literacy Leadership Award presented by the Pulpwood Queens, the largest book club in the United States. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Good to see our friend Dana in our audience now as well.
Yeah, we'll bring Dana up later. Welcome, welcome. This is so much fun. So, Jonathan, I wanted to ask you some questions at the beginning here, and then we'll see how things go and see how people come and go from the show, and do some question and answer and some interaction a little bit later. How's that sound?
That sounds like a great plan.
That sounds like a great plan. That's wonderful. Hey, tell me a little bit more about where you started. You moved from Kentucky to South Carolina, and then your professional career began. Can you tell me a little bit about your first job and then what it led to and what it led to and then what you're currently doing?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I'm always happy to talk about that path. I get to do that with young writers, high school and college kids quite a bit too, because it's never a direct path. Nobody out there is a middle school student saying, "I hope I get to grow up to be a university press director." That's not a dream that children have, but you discover along the way, as I did, the pathways that can lead you to where you're supposed to be. And I started out as an undergraduate at the University of Tennessee Martin, west end of the state, thinking I was going to be a chemist and work in the sciences. And I absolutely loved that in high school and in college. But I turned out to be a terrible chemist. I broke a ton of beakers in the laboratory and realized this was not going to be my future. But I was enjoying writing and storytelling and certainly reading as well. And I started to look for ways to bridge those interests together, both the sciences and writing. And there's this wonderful field called technical writing. And this is work done by any number of heroes out there who are assigned to work with people doing research or complicated technical work who perhaps are not the best storytellers and advocates for what they're doing. And somebody else, the technical writer, can be the conduit between the work that's being done and the audience that needs to be informed of that work. So that's the path I was on for a while, thinking I would end up doing that kind of work for a major chemistry company. And then I just got more and more interested in the English side of it. So I went from being a chemistry major with an English minor to being an English major with minors in chemistry and history and ultimately anthropology. And all the while, I was just absolutely loving being a student, being a college student, and getting to work with this amazing group of teachers and learn whatever I was interested in. And that kind of led me to the same mindset I had when I entered grad school at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, thinking that I just wanted to prolong this college experience for as much time as people would pay me to do it. And I really enjoyed my classes at SIU. I was in grad school for literature, but there was also a really robust creative writing program and a rhetoric program in that department as well. And they were all sort of intermingled to me. But what I came to understand in the course of working on my master's degree is that I had just kind of lost my enthusiasm for being in the classroom on either side of the big desk. I loved learning. I loved working with ideas, with books, with writers, but I didn't necessarily want to do it in a classroom situation anymore. So I did not do what would have been the next obvious thing, which would have been to continue on for my PhD, as so many people were encouraging me to do. Instead, I answered a want ad in our local newspaper to be a marketing assistant for the university press, which I knew existed. I knew that there was a book publisher, a small book publisher there at SIU because some of my professors had been published by it, or they were what are known as series editors. So they were responsible for thematically connected books being published by the press. So I was very much aware of it, but it honestly had never occurred to me to go into publishing. And I answered this want ad. I had done some marketing work for a small museum as an undergraduate, and then later for a small rural hospital when I was in grad school. So I had a surprisingly robust resume already in marketing and publicity, and I was enjoying that work. I was enjoying being a storyteller for events and workshops and those sorts of things, helping audiences come to places where their interests would be rewarded. That was exciting to me. So I responded to this one ad for a part-time contract work assignment, no guarantee of long-term employment, no benefits, no nothing. And I just thought, I would maybe do this for a year. And then by that point, perhaps I would have gotten over this mindset that I didn't belong in a classroom anymore and I'd go back for the PhD program. But instead, I just absolutely fell in love with small press, university press publishing. And the one ad was placed by the woman who became my first mentor, and I would say the most important mentor in my professional life, Lisa Baer, who at that point was marketing director of SIU Press and a rising star in university press publication. Lisa was just a phenomenal mentor. She took me under her wing and introduced me to this great big weird confusing world of publishing and the work that goes on when you're in a university community but not a professor, when you have a kind of a different role in a university community. And then Lisa did the absolute best thing she could have done for me professionally. She left. She left and took another job far, far away. And then I had to learn a bunch of things that she had not yet taught me entirely on my own and kind of master it all very quickly. The result of which was that after about, 4, maybe 5 years at SIU Press, I had risen very quickly from the temp, the part timer, to being the assistant marketing director, working for a new boss, and learning quite a bit about publicity and more about editing. But this was also as far as I could go in Carbondale. This was, I was going to have to wait a long time if I were going to rise any farther in the ranks there. And Carbondale, Illinois is a sweet little college town. There's probably about 3 years worth of things you can do there. And I was about to enter my 8th year in Carbondale. So, boredom was setting in with the town. And I found myself with opportunities to go either to Northern Illinois University, just outside of Carbondale, to be marketing director there, or to go to the University of South Carolina Press, Columbia, South Carolina, and be marketing director there. I was the top candidate in both of those searches. And when I came to Columbia, to South Carolina, to our capital city, I just felt something really powerful, a connection to South Carolina. And it's one I feel to this day, that the state is still actively trying to become a better version of itself. And that's not true everywhere. That's certainly not true everywhere. But I really genuinely feel this is true about South Carolina. And there at University of South Carolina Press, the director, Curtis Clark, had been in Carbondale. He had been an editorial director at SIU Press. So even though our time did not overlap, he knew about me. He knew my reputation from the work I was doing at Southern Illinois. And he made a commitment to me early on that he would help me develop my interests in publishing on the editorial side, which was not the job I was being hired for, and really kind of be my coach toward the idea that I too would become a press director at one day, which is the same ambition that Curtis had when he was at SIU and Lisa as well. That press, as small and tiny as it is, has produced 3, 4, maybe 5 university press directors now, including me, Lisa, and Curtis. So something about that experience really set us on the right path. And Curtis recognized that in me immediately. So he was a wonderful mentor as well. And then very much as Lisa had done for me so many years before, Curtis also, when the time came to pursue other opportunities, left the press and created a new opportunity for me. So I was advanced in the ranks very quickly to being interim press director and then hired as full-time director. And I had been doing this, in university press world for about, what would that have been, 12, 13 years. So I was one of the youngest university press directors of that time, certainly not the youngest ever. But there I was suddenly doing the marketing work and the editorial work and making decisions about what the future of this university press would be, suddenly in command of $1 million budget and 17 professional staff members. And it was all very
Wow.
exciting. But that's the moment when Pat Conroy entered my life as well and set me on a path that was completely unexpected.
Jonathan, and you just had a birthday the other night, and you're only 49 years old. Can I say that on this
41.
broadcast?
Yes.
Well,
Yes, indeed.
congratulations on such an amazing career up to this point. And I've enjoyed interacting with you with my virtual book club. And then we just held the first annual, hopefully, right, Lowcountry Literary and Leisure Getaway down here. And I just want to kind of pivot to all of your accomplishments. You're also a published author. And I want to have you tell us a little bit about Our Prince of Scribes, how writers remember Pat Conroy. And in case anybody in the audience or that listens elsewhere, maybe exactly who Pat Conroy is if they're unaware.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that as kind of an interwoven story. So Pat Conroy, easily the best known writer from South Carolina and arguably the best known from the American South, was the author of 12 books, novels and memoirs. Probably the most famous among them is The Prince of Tides, which was made into a major motion picture with Nick Nolte and Barbra Streisand. But people are familiar certainly with The Great Santini and Lords of Discipline and The Water is Wide, which turns 50 years old this year. And Pat kind of appeared in my life at a moment when I needed a mentor one more time and did not realize that I needed a mentor. He was the most famous person, author or otherwise, in South Carolina when I was rising in the ranks at USC Press. And I came to know Pat first as a publicist, as somebody who reached out to him in the hopes that he would write what's called a blurb, an endorsement that appears on the back of a book. But Pat and I developed a friendship that lasted, about 7 years, nothing particularly substantial in those 7 years. But when I became director of USC Press, Pat realized that, as his teacher, Gene Norris, once said about Pat, that I was trying to be someone. I wasn't trying to be nobody. I was trying to be someone. And Pat recognized that potential and that he could help me on that. So he stepped in at a time in his life when he didn't have to do anything for anybody and became this wonderful mentor figure to me. And ultimately a partner. We created a fiction imprint together called Story River Books, which you mentioned in my introduction. And during the last 5 years of Mr. Conroy's life, so for him from the age of 65 to 70, we championed and edited and ultimately published 22 books together, novels and short story collections by writers who maybe would not have had a chance to be published without a guy like Pat Conroy on their side. And two of those books, The Headmaster's Darlings and One Good Mama Bone, both went on to win the Willie Morris Award for Southern Fiction, which is a $10,000 national prize. So the only two books by a small press, by a university press, to have won that award at that point. So that was a huge deal for us and very validating that we were on the right path with these writers and the Story River model. But pancreatic cancer had other plans for Pat, and he passed away just after his 70th birthday. And one of Pat's Story River writers, Nicole Seitz, a novelist and a really talented visual artist from Charleston, South Carolina, and we had a conversation after Pat had announced his diagnosis to the world and before he passed away, that we were just two of many writers who had been influenced and mentored and taught by Pat. And there were so many of us out there. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could gather together some stories from other writers like ourselves and put those together quickly in a book, maybe fast enough that we could, in fact, share those stories with Pat while he was sick. And that idea really caught on for both of us, but there just wasn't enough time to do it quickly. I think, if I remember correctly, Pat passed away about 2 weeks after Nicole and I had this first conversation. And then the project just took on a completely different weight. It was something that needed to be done right, smartly, and well, no matter how long it took. And in the end, we spent about 1.5 years gathering stories and reflections from 67 writers who were mentored by Pat over the whole arc of his roughly 50-year writing career, from people who were classmates of Pat's at Beaufort High School when his writing career was really just beginning, who were there to witness his very first publications in the student literary magazine Breakers, to folks like me who knew Pat much, much later in life. And this list included family members, because there are many members of the Conroy family who are writers, including Pat's brother Tim, his widow Cassandra, his daughter Melissa. And all the while we were gathering this, we were seeing public remembrances of Pat being published as well. Rick Bragg, for example, Pulitzer Prize winner Rick Bragg, published a beautiful remembrance of Pat in his column in Southern Living and his fellow Pulitzer Prize winner, Kathleen Parker, did one in the Washington Post. So we were reaching out to these writers and trying to get permission to use pieces that were already being published, in addition to reaching out to other writers who we knew had something to share, but hadn't had a public forum to do that in yet. And 67 pieces were just remarkable. For Nicole and I to kind of share these back and forth through emails and text exchange during that year and a half. It was a way for us to get to know Pat in a way that we hadn't when he was around, through other people's experiences, and to get to know these other writers as well. All of that led to the publication of Our Prince of Scribes, the anthology in 2018, published not by the University of South Carolina Press, where I had been director, but actually published by the University of Georgia Press, where by that
And
point my
can
first
I
publishing mentor was director.
can
Yes, Susie,
can I interject there because
please.
I'm an alumni of the University of Georgia. So
Right.
I what was how did that happen in that way after everything that had why did that happen? Tell me
That's
the backstory on that.
absolutely, and that is a great question. When I left USC Press in the course of working on Our Prince of Scribes to become the first director of the Conroy Center, all interest in Pat Conroy at that press left with me, which is pretty remarkable given what Pat had done for that press and how successful some of the Story River books had been. But that's the nature of changes in leadership. The press did not have the same vision for its future that I did when I was there. But luckily, by that time, my first publishing mentor, Lisa Baer, was director of the University of Georgia Press. Lisa actually became director at Georgia the very same day that I became director at USC Press. So if we were having a race to see who would become press director first, we tied, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, Lisa had a head start, but I had the advantage of having been taught by Lisa, and that kind of evened it out between us. And she was really interested in what I was doing at the Conroy Center and this project. And Pat Conroy was born in Atlanta, so he is a Georgian by birth, and he had been inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame before he had ever been inducted into the South Carolina Writers Hall of Fame. So Georgia certainly had a strong claim to Pat as well. And Lisa was able to reach out to the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame and make that case so successfully that they did something they had never done before in the whole history of the Writers Hall of Fame. They wrote a check for a book publication. They paid for the first printing of Our Prince of Scribes as a gift to Georgia, to the press, and to all of the writers involved. Incredible act of generosity to make that book possible. And Lisa Baer and UGA Press have just been phenomenal to work with since that book has come out. They've been so supportive. And as you mentioned, the book has now won an embarrassingly large number of awards, 17. That's a lot to keep up with. And
It's
UGA was really
fantastic.
supportive through the whole process of applying for and receiving those awards and making sure that people know that all these wonderful things are happening for that book. So it definitely landed with the right publisher at the right time.
That is absolutely fantastic. And I just wanted to welcome everyone that's down in our audience. We have friends, Dana she's an author as well. It looks like Rebecca might be joining us, Donette, Wendy, Chris, and Woody. Thanks everybody for joining myself, Susie McMahon with Tales from the Lowcountry, with Jonathan Haupt, an author, publicist, publisher, director, and the executive director of the Pat Conroy Literary Center here in Beaufort, South Carolina. Jonathan, would you read us an excerpt from Prince of Scribes?
I would love to. I'll do just a very quick setup for this. And then the excerpt I'm going to read is about a page long. So as the book was coming out, Nicole and I started to get notices from friends, from people we knew well and people we didn't know quite so well, who were very excited about this. And one of those was a student of Pat Conroy's who lives here in Beaufort, who had been taught psychology by Pat during his year of teaching at Beaufort High School, same high school he graduated from, before he went out to DeFusky. And I remember her email so clearly. She said, when I saw that you and Nicole and the other writers were putting this book out, I knew immediately that I wanted to buy it, but I wasn't sure that I wanted to read it because I didn't want to be sad 67 times. And then she did read it and realized that this is not a sad book. This is very often a very funny book because Mr. Conroy's life was so robust and so well lived. This is ultimately a celebration of that life. So with that in mind, I want to read one of the more humorous pieces. And this is from a writer that people very often do not think of as being terribly funny, and that's Ron Rash, an Appalachian novelist, probably best known for the book Serena, which was made into a film with Jennifer Lawrence and Bradley Cooper. And I'll quickly say, before I read this excerpt, that Ron and Pat had this wonderful friendship that was both supportive and competitive, which is often the way that Pat was with other male writers. And Ron's excerpt speaks to that. So I'll read it for you. One thing I learned early on about Pat was that any story I told, he would top. I suspect that if I had said my grandmother had been eaten by a grizzly bear, Pat would have had a grandmother eaten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. My favorite example of this took place one night when we were sharing stories of dispiriting book signings, and I told Pat I had endured the worst such signing ever. Let's hear it, Pat said, and so I told of an event years earlier when I had done a reading and signing at a small library in South Carolina. Books would be available for sale, my host assured me. Books were indeed there, but the audience was not. 3 people showed up: the person who'd invited me, a friend of his who promptly fell asleep, and a grim-faced nun who appeared to have come solely as an act of penance. After my event, I dutifully went, pen in hand, to the signing table. None of the 3 came near the table. 0 books sold, I told Pat. 0. Nobody even picked one up to pretend they might buy it. It doesn't get any worse than that. Pat looked at me, a twinkle in his eye. Oh, no, he said in his way. I can top that. How do you top 0 books sold? I asked. I'll tell you how. Pat answered and began a story about a book signing soon after self-publishing his first book, The Boo. The signing was in a chain bookstore. He'd been given a chair and a small table on which he placed copies of the book. He sat and waited for customers to come his way. As the 2-hour signing was about to expire, Pat hadn't sold a single book. Few people had even made eye contact. But then an elderly man did. He came over and spent the next few minutes talking to Pat, finally picking up a book to peruse it. After a while longer, he decided to purchase a copy, but only if Pat would personalize the book for him. So Pat asked the man's name, wrote the name, a few kind words, then signed and dated the book. The man thanked him and was about to go pay for the book. Then, according to Pat, the man took one step toward the checkout counter, fell to the floor, and died. That's not 0, Pat said, since the book could be neither sold nor returned. That's -1. So that is a story that may or may not have ever happened, but that's not the point of it. Ron Rash needed an uplifting story in that moment, and Pat Conroy provided one, and that was very much the nature of Pat. For a guy who was able to put so much darkness on the page, he was tremendously funny in life, one of the most naturally funny people I've ever met, and it was really kind of Ron to remember that story and share it in Scribes.
So did you see what I just love that story. It makes me laugh even in a dark way. And
Yes.
I don't know, for those of you that are new to Fireside, you can see that this is an interactive platform. And on the bottom right-hand corner, you've got a react button. So it's not really an interruption. It's just giving feedback to Jonathan and I. So I just want to let you feel free to react to what we're saying tonight. Give us some feedback. And I wanted to welcome Matthew and Chris to our audience. Jonathan, I have another question for you.
Sure, Susie.
When was Our Princess Scribes published again?
It was September of 2018.
And is it normal for authors to talk for how many years is this about a book? I mean, this has been a long run where you're able, and all the other contributors have done a lot of outreach about it, right?
It really has. It's been incredible in that regard, too. As some of our author friends and our audience know, typically a book tour lasts about 2 weeks if you're lucky, maybe 2 months if you're really lucky. And this book tour has been going on for years and years now. And of the 67 writers who participated in the book, who shared their words, 54 of them have appeared in at least one public event, some of them many more than one, some of them a dozen or more. So they continue to give very generously of their time as well. And, to some degree, that's a reflection on me, but more than anything else, it's a reflection on Pat Conroy and how dear that relationship was to them, that this is their way to pay that forward with by honoring readers and writers. And as we were doing these public conversations about scribes with different combinations of panelists all over the country at book festivals and libraries and all sorts of events that just were phenomenal to see the turnout, the kinds of people who would show up to hear us talk about Pat Conroy was just outstanding. But in the Q&A that would always end these panels, there were more and more questions about the craft and business of writing. And it became obvious that many of these attendees were writers or they wanted to be writers. And with that in mind, I launched the Our Prince of Scribes Writers Conferences, of which we've now done, I think, 5 of them at different locations around South Carolina, including one that was virtual and had an audience from all over the country, in which the faculty members, the workshop instructors, are all writers who participated in Our Prince of Scribes. And this is another way in which we can kind of pay back the way that Pat helped us and mentored and taught us, writer to writer, peer to peer, as he himself had been taught by the novelist Anne Head when he was a teenager, and a wonderful encounter he had with Archibald Rutledge, who was South Carolina's first poet laureate, Pat Conroy, before there was a Pat Conroy. So our Prince of Scribes Writers Conferences, which I certainly hope we continue to do when the opportunity presents itself again, have been a way in which we have now taught just shy of 150 writers who've participated in these conferences. And then there was another aspect of this book, too, that was completely unexpected, just a wonderful bit of serendipity and some ambition and extreme talent on Nicole's part. She had really wanted to honor all of the writers who participated in this project. And as I mentioned, Nicole's a really talented visual artist. So one day she did a sketch of Pat and posted it online, and people were very responsive, very positive about that. The next day she did a sketch of Barbara Streisand, who wrote the foreword to Our Prince of Scribes. And once again, people were very supportive of that. And she realized that there was almost exactly 67 days between that date and the publication date of Our Prince of Scribes. And so she gave herself a challenge to sketch all of the contributors, one sketch a day, and just publish these online, really just something she was doing on social media. And many of these writers she had never met in person. So she was not working from memory or experience. She was working from reference photographs and just a sense of who they were from their writing. But she did it, and that's just sort of true of Nicole. She sets her mind to something and she gets it done. So by publication date, we had these amazing sketches that she had done of all the 67 contributors, plus Pat Conroy. And as director of the Conroy Center, as a museum person, it started to occur to me that this was something that needed a presence, not just on social media, but as an exhibit, as a museum quality exhibit. And so I created one with Nicole's permission, and that originally debuted at the Conroy Center during our Pat Conroy Literary Festival in the fall, when we also did a major launch event for Our Prince of Scribes. But that exhibit has since traveled to the Southeastern Independent Booksellers Alliance trade show, and it's been on display at the Crescendo Festival on Hilton Head at one of the galleries there. And it'll go back to Hilton Head at some point, and the Morris Museum, or excuse me, the Morris Center for Lowcountry Heritage is interested in it. So that exhibit, that entirely unexpected exhibit of Nicole's artwork responding to Our Prince of Scribes, has taken on a life of its own as well. So this book, this project, has lived many lives, well above and beyond anything we envisioned when we first started talking about the possibility of gathering these stories together.
It's just magnificent. I just love it. And I'm holding my brand new copy of the book that I purchased during our getaway this last weekend. Sorry if I'm making noise on my mic, but I'm gonna be selfish, and I'm gonna ask you to tell the story of Sally Ann Robinson and maybe read her section, or do you want to jump and read your own, or our friend Lynn Selden? There's so many amazing contributors in here. It's just so touching. And River Siddons is in here.
She is.
Goodness.
Anne has passed away to a beautiful piece in which I don't have it flagged, so I apologize if I'm paraphrasing rather than quoting it directly. But she said that Pat's absence left a Pat Conroy-sized hole in our hearts that can only be filled with stories. which is ultimately really what led us to put the book together too. But I'd be glad to share Sally Ann's story, our dear friend Sally Ann. That is actually a favorite of mine from the collection. And for
Me
those
too.
who
Me
are
too.
unfamiliar with Sally Ann, Pat Conroy went out to Defusky Island when he was 25 years old, I think, to be the first white school teacher, the first male school teacher on the island. It's 1969. And Sally Ann was one of the 15 students he had. She was 11 years old at the time. He had fifth through eighth grade and no experience whatsoever teaching kids that young. And he got out there and realized that separate had not been equal, that he had been lied to about that, the world had been lied to about that. And he threw himself completely into giving these students the best quality of education he could, which in the end was not only equal to their white counterparts in town, it was actually superior, far superior to their white counterparts, because Pat was just a remarkable teacher in that way. And Sally Ann Robinson is Pat Conroy's dream come true for what he hoped would happen in the lives of those students. She really took to heart Pat's lessons and has become many, many things, including a teacher herself. She was one of four of Pat's students from Defusky who went on to become teachers, at least for a while. But Sally Ann is probably best known as what we would call a culture keeper here in the Lowcountry. And that manifests for her by being a celebrity chef of Gullah inspired, of family recipes, of island recipes. She's a sixth generation native of Defusky Island, and she's the author of at least three cookbooks, maybe four, and also a short history of Defusky Island. She's been on the Food Network and in Oprah's magazine and Southern Living and Garden and Gun. And every good thing that can happen to you as a chef and a food writer has happened to Sally Ann multiple times. And in
Yeah,
her
isn't
essay,
sh oh, I didn't mean to interrupt, but isn't she
no,
was
go
in
ahead, Susie,
Netflix, and
please.
I'm so sorry, Netflix on The High on the Hog, right? She's in the
Yes,
second
she
episode
was.
of that.
Yes. Yeah, so a lot of people are familiar with Sally Ann and by extension, Defusky Island because of her. And she owns her own tour company on Defusky now, as your tour group got to experience and as I've experienced many times. She is a phenomenal tour guide of that island. And that's really the best way to see the island is in Sally Ann's company. But in her essay, which appears in Art Prince of Scribes, it's an expanded version of a short article that she wrote for Life magazine for the annual tribute issue in memory of Pat. And I gave her the opportunity to expand on that, which she did beautifully. So I'm just going to read a short section in which she remembers what it was like being a Pat Conroy's student on Defusky in 1969. That school year was unforgettable for me. Pat was patient and generous. He made every day an adventure while teaching us about history, math, spelling, reading, music. You name it, he taught it. And all the while, he was preparing us for the wide world we were going to face when we left our island. He could take the words in a book and bring them to life for us. We were amazed. Pat had a way of making it seem easy to learn something difficult, like it was a game. I was a curious student, hungry for knowledge. I got up every morning wanting to go to school because this wonderful teacher would be there who would make learning fun while opening our eyes to a future we didn't know was ours. Pat taught me to be a go getter. Get out there and get it. It's all out there for you, he would say. Education is your freedom, and know that you can do anything you want if you want it bad enough. So Sally Ann really took that to heart and pays it forward by teaching people in the way that she does as tour guide and culture keeper and cookbook author and just masterful storyteller. But it all begins for her as an 11-year-old kid being taught by Pat Conroy.
So that is just wonderful, and meeting her in person is just an experience that you have to do to understand. It's almost magical, and I wanted to ask you one final question and then invite some of our friends in the audience to come up and ask you a question if they're comfortable. All you have to do once I send an invitation to you to speak is accept it. You'll come up here on the stage and you'll automatically be unmuted. So if you want to, at first, to make sure the dogs aren't barking or whatever in the background, hit the little microphone button on the bottom of your app, which will mute you, and then you hit it again to unmute. But Jonathan, what is your most favorite story that you've shared with me over the last week and also when we've done virtual book club talks? about how, you met Pat Conroy. There's something about a letter and the reference, and can you share that story with us?
Yeah, sure. Let me see if I have it within reach. I do actually.
Okay.
Yes.
Yay.
So, I met Pat first as a publicist, just as a guy who asked him to do things, and sometimes he would do them and sometimes he wouldn't, because a lot of people, hundreds of people, were asking Pat to do things. But he learned to trust my judgment and to appreciate that I would not ask him to do things I did not believe in. And that became really important to both of us to be valued and recognized by somebody like Pat Conroy, who had that level of faith in me, was really transformative for me. And when I had the chance to go from being the publicist at USC Press to the publisher to the director, Pat stepped up and wrote this really wonderful letter of recommendation for me. And I have the handwritten copy here in my home office. I use it in presentations sometimes because it says more about my relationship with Pat than anything I could say. And it says it in Pat's own words. And I won't read the whole thing, but let me read from two sections of it. So this is Pat when he was about 65 years old, writing in support of me. So this is what Pat Conroy thought of as a letter of recommendation. It begins with this. My name is Pat Conroy, and I'm a South Carolina writer. I've got 4 brothers and a sister who are Gamecocks and consider me a much lesser man because I'm only a Citadel Bulldog. I'm writing this letter in support, no, in ridiculous, enthusiastic support of Jonathan Haupt for the director of the University of South Carolina Press. Though I don't have to tell you this, I believe South Carolina Press represents the cultural heartbeat of the state. I have a long and fruitful association with it, and Jonathan Haupt recently got me to write an introduction to State of the Heart, a group of personal essays by South Carolina writers edited by Aida Rogers. The amazing thing about this fact is that Jonathan Haupt has never passed a single nickel or dime from his hand to mine. He gets me to do things by his professionalism, his complete charm, and a love of the work he does. He understands his role as a caretaker of the South Carolina experience, and he causes me to think about it as he entices me in his Cobra-like fashion when he explains what new favor I can do for him. If he gets this job, I would like you to demand he never ask a single thing of me again. But I admire his passion and dedication for his job and his enormous dedication to getting it done right. I was once a student of the great James Dickey on your campus. It was in that class that I learned of the central importance of the South Carolina press. I think Jonathan Haupt is the best thing that ever happened to the press. I urge you and your committee to support him and get him off my back. Very sincerely yours, Pat Conroy.
Oh my goodness, how funny. And what it's so fun to hear that story each and every time. It's just so enjoyable.
It's
So, Jonathan, what do you think about Fireside? This is your first time ever on the app, and I think the majority of our audience as well. What are your thoughts on this initial experience?
This is fun. I would love to do it with video added too. That's something we've not tried out tonight, and perhaps we will in future shows. But I've been a podcast host for about a year and a half. A podcast was given to me as a gift by the Authors on the Air Global Network. And I've really come to value these opportunities to engage with audiences in this way. But here on Fireside, we've got opportunities for interaction with folks, which is not really true of the way my podcast is run. So I'm excited to get to hear what our audience questions are. And I love that you can react to this as well. So by all means, try out that react feature if you haven't given it a go yet.
Absolutely. And I've sent some invitations down to Donette. Now, I just want to say something about my friend Donette down there, and I hope they'll accept my invitation to speak. I just met Donette Lee last week, and welcome to the stage, Donette. Give me just a second. She is older than I am, and she got up on this app faster than anyone I've ever seen get on an app. Donette, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. I appreciate your confidence, Susie.
Hey, Donette. Good to
Hey,
hear
Jonathan.
you. I'm so glad you're with us tonight.
I am too. It was more of a challenge joining in tonight than it was downloading the app in the beginning, though.
Right. And I have to tell you, I think sometimes just pushing new buttons and a new setup is kind of crazy for all of us. But Donna, I bet you have a question for Jonathan tonight. Can I put you on the
Oh my, I thought I had already asked him every question I could think of. Um, well, mainly just to say that the thing I have appreciated most about listening to Jonathan is the stories that he can tell us about Pat that we don't get from his books per se. And so, just like the one he read to us from Ron Rash, I just love those personal stories. So, if you'd like to retell the one about Pat getting The Water is Wide published, that is my favorite of all.
That's a good one, Donette, and I'm happy to share that story again. And thank you, certainly, for your comments. I love it when I hear after a talk or reading or anything I've done regarding Pat Conroy, when somebody from the audience tells me they feel like they know him in a different way, and that means a lot for a guy who wrote 12 books that are mostly about himself. You sort of think that everything's covered, but so it's nice to hear from people that I've given them a new way in. And the story you're referencing is really timely because this is the 50th anniversary of Pat's teaching memoir, The Water is Wide. And Pat had I love telling this story at writers' conferences because people think of Pat Conroy as the venerable author of beach music and the Prince of Tides, the guy who was at the top of his game. But he didn't start out that way. He started out as a guy who didn't know anything about anything, which is how we all start out. And that was very true of his Water is Wide experience. So I'll tell a slightly abbreviated version of this story because I see Dana's on the stage too, and I want to save some time for other questions. But Pat wrote The Water is Wide after being fired from his job of teaching on Defusky Island. He had sued for wrongful termination, sued the school district, and that became a national news story. And reporters came down from the Washington Post and the New York Times to tiny little Beaufort, South Carolina, to interview the fired white school teacher and cover this trial. And several of them were telling Pat that he really needed to tell this story in a bigger way, bigger than a newspaper article. This needed to be a book. And Pat kind of knew what that meant because he had self-published an earlier book called The Boo, which was written in defense of his mentor at the Citadel, the military college in Charleston, Colonel Corvasi, whose nickname was The Boo. And Pat had self-published that book. He had taken out a bank loan in town for, I think, $4,000 and had found a printer in Columbia to print that. And Pat had basically sold the copies out of the trunk of his car to fellow Citadel alumni members and had turned a small profit on that book. So he'd had a small but positive experience. And that was really all he knew about publishing. But these reporters from Washington and New York were really telling Pat he needed to go to a large scale publisher and big New York publisher. And to do that, he needed a literary agent. And one of them gave Pat contact information for a guy named Julian Bach, who was one of the top 10, maybe even top 5 literary agents at the time. And Julian had certainly never heard of Beaufort, South Carolina. He probably never heard of South Carolina when Pat Conroy called him up to make this plea as to why Julian should have a look at Pat's manuscript. And Julian was convinced by this passionate young man who spoke so beautifully about his African American students and his experiences with the school district. So Julian kind of reluctantly agreed to see the typed manuscript. And Pat did not know how to type. So there was, in fact, no typed manuscript. But this is where Pat's mother and his wife and the women of Beaufort really rallied around Pat in this remarkable way. And they each typed up a chapter of his handwritten manuscript on different paper, different letterhead, numbering each chapter from 1 to whatever the end of the chapter was. So in the end, it was a mess, a beautifully done mess, a sweet thing to do, but a great big mess. And this is what Pat had to send to the legendary Julian Bach. And Julian called Pat about a week later and said, Mr. Conroy, I want you to know that we've received your manuscript here in the office. I haven't read a word of it yet, but it's the cutest thing we've ever seen. And which is not really what you want to hear when you've written a serious book, but it was better than an immediate rejection. And a couple weeks later, Julian called Pat a second time and said, Pat, I have wonderful news for you. I found a publisher for The Water is Wide. It's Houghton Mifflin, a great American publisher of Henry David Thoreau and Emily Dickinson. And here's the best part, Pat. It's $7,500. And according to Pat, he cleared his throat, paused for a minute, and said to Julian, "But Julian, I can get it done much cheaper down here." And then it was Julian's turn to pause and clear his throat. And Julian finally replied, "Pat, you do realize it is they who pay you to publish and not the other way around. My God, people in Beaufort must be relieved." And so this thus began the publishing career of Pat Conroy with Houghton Mifflin, the publisher that would stick with him through Prince of Tides, and Julian Bach, the agent who would stick with Pat through the sale of the book after that, of Beach Music. It all began with Pat Conroy standing up for himself, suing for wrongful termination, causing this court case to become such uh, a national news story, and that getting him access to reporters who in turn get him access to Julian Bach, and then making his case with Julian Bach. It was Pat standing up for himself time and time again that made his writing career possible. And yeah, he started out doing, every single thing wrong because he was just a kid from Beaufort, South Carolina. But he was really fortunate to find himself in the company of folks like Julian Bach, who would take him seriously, who would look after him. And I love that aspect of that story too. I mean, there's so many reasons for Julian Bach to not pick up the phone, not take Pat Conroy seriously, just kind of let the whole thing slide. But he doesn't. Those were two guys who were destined to be in each other's lives.
I just love that story, Donna. Thank you so much for coming up and asking that question. I was going to move on to Dana Rittenauer that's joined us on the stage. Can you unmute yourself? And I think we probably have time for one more question or one or two, Jonathan. Does that sound okay?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Jonathan. I love all the stories and everything. I was wondering if you'd like to tell us, though, about what the Pat Conroy Center does as far as keeping Pat's legacy alive, some of the programs that go on there, specifically the work with the younger people, the interns at the Pat Conroy Center, because I'm really impressed with that group of young people. They are so mature, and it's just wonderful to see them mature and blossom like they've done.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Dana. I'm really proud of that work too, and I'm always happy to talk about that. And you've gotten to see them firsthand multiple times now, you and Susie and Danette, all of you, really. So a couple of years ago, one of our fellow Our Prince of Scribes contributors, um, Stephanie Austin Edwards, who was a Beaufort High School classmate of Pat Conroy's, came into the office of the then very young Conroy Center. We were still in our first location. And for those of you not familiar, just to kind of give a framework to Dana's question, the center is a real place. It is a museum that you can visit, and more than 3,000 people a year come through our doors to tour our interpretive center, where Dana is one of many volunteers who give guided tours and really kind of take you through the artifacts of Pat's writing and teaching life in a really educational and, on a good day, inspirational way. And the center does public programming in which we host guest authors as well. And I do touring lectures all over the South about Mr. Conroy. And that was kind of where we were at the point when Stephanie came into my office and said, "Wouldn't it be great if we had a high school intern?" And I said, "No, Stephanie, that is a terrible idea. Let's make sure we never, ever do that." And it wasn't because I really was resistant to the idea of working with kids. I had been mentoring college students throughout my university press career, but the center was just so young, and we were just trying to figure out what we were going to do, what our presence would be. That I didn't think we had the time or the wherewithal to be bringing a kid into our lives. And Stephanie, did not take no for an answer, to her credit, and continued to make a case as to why I should meet a freshman, a high school freshman named Holland Perryman, a 14-year-old who was already showing remarkable potential as a writer and as a servant leader. And I was just convinced by Stephanie that I should at least have this conversation. And I did. And Holland came in with a resume, like any other 14-year-old, a multi-page resume of accomplishments she had already achieved. And something about her really just spoke to me. And I was reminded that, at one point, Pat Conroy was a high school kid too. And he wouldn't have gotten as far as he did, as quickly as he did, if teachers and mentors hadn't stepped up for him. And here was my chance as director of the Conroy Center to do that to a kid who seemed to me very much like she was going to be the Pat Conroy of that particular moment at Beaufort High. So now Holland is entering into her 4th year as the Conroy Center's first student intern, and she really has become everything at Beaufort High that Pat Conroy was: a student body president, award-winning writer. She's created the largest student organization at Beaufort High, DALO, Diversity Awareness Youth Literacy Organization, 50 student members, in response to her Conroy Center experiences with social justice programming. And now DALO is a partner with the Conroy Center in public events in the same way that the public library or any university would be, because DALO really is that sophisticated of a program. So, after a few years of success with Holland, I was asked to consider the possibility of working with other students as well. And I reached out to the English department at Beaufort High School and asked for some recommendations, and they gave me several. But the students who were most strongly recommended were senior Alicia Aurora and junior Millie Bennett, and they joined the Conroy Center as interns about 6 months ago. And they have done phenomenal work, as Susie and Dana and Danette have now seen. They have quickly stepped up and have had some opportunities in the past couple of weeks to talk about what this experience has meant to them and how much personal growth they've seen as writers, as leaders, as young artists and advocates, and how important it is to them to get to work with a mentor outside of their school experiences, somebody who can really bring the larger world of what nonprofits do and what literature is and what servant leadership is into their lives. And it's been tremendously meaningful to me, and it's never lost on me, that I almost said no to the whole thing, that I really didn't want to do it at first. And now it's become one of the most important aspects of my life. Above and beyond the 3 Beaufort High School student interns, above and beyond Holland and Alicia and Millie, I'm working with, I think, 7 other kids across the district in varying ways. Several are members of a creative writing class that I'm mentoring. A few kids have been aimed my way by their teachers and by Melissa Murray, who's director of literacy programs for the whole district. Kids who are showing remarkable potential above and beyond what their classroom teachers can really dedicate their time to. And through Camp Conroy, our annual summer camp, I've gotten to work with 16 kids last summer, probably 20 to 22 this summer, ages 8 through 14. 2 of those kids who've been with us since the very first camp, Ali and Alex, have now transitioned from being campers, from being students in the camp, to being camp counselors, to being teachers. And it's been just tremendously rewarding to be their mentor as they've crossed that threshold from being student to young teacher themselves. So, getting to work with kids in all of these different ways, in the same way that Pat had been mentored by his teachers, Gene Norris, Bill Dufford, Ann Head, and ultimately in the same way that Pat was my mentor and mentor to all of the Our Prince of Scribes writers, has just been tremendously meaningful for me, and an increasingly large and visible part of what the Conroy Center gets to do in this community too, to see that Pat Conroy is not the last writer from Beaufort, that new generations have the same opportunities, if not more opportunities than he had, and that storytellers come from everywhere, and they certainly come from here in the Lowcountry.
Absolutely, Jonathan. And I just wanted to thank you for joining me tonight for my first ever show on Fireside. I've been watching and learning for about a year. And speaking of authors, the woman who just asked that question, I want everybody to know that Dana has agreed to be my second guest. I have a little bit of a gap in the programming because I have to be somewhere that there's not going to be Wi-Fi bandwidth, and I'm happy for that. I'm going to head out on a cruise. I'm a travel planner, travel organizer, and concierge for a living, and I'm headed to the Western Caribbean. So I'm going to be drinking a tropical drink and sitting in a lounge chair for a bit. But Dana, real quick, will you just give an overall, just tell me what you used to do and the fact that you are in the Beaufort area as well, and just kind of a 30-second promo for what we're going to talk about on April 6th, and then I'll wrap up with Jonathan in just a second.
Sure. Well, I'm a retired FBI agent. I spent 21 years in the FBI. About 13 of those years were in an undercover capacity of one form or another. So I retired 6 years ago, and the day I retired, I launched my first book, which, looking back, wasn't the smartest thing to ever do. I didn't understand that I needed to build a platform and all that good stuff, but that's what I did. I retired from the FBI, and I wrote my first book and launched it the day that I retired. And since then, I've written three total in that series, and it's a series about an FBI undercover agent. So that's the Lexi Montgomery series. And that's what I've been doing for the last 6 years. That and obsessively fishing.
She's obsessive, an incredible fisherwoman, and it looks like you're a taekwondo as well. I really look forward to our show, and if you're ready to do video, let me know. I was scared to do it tonight, being my first show. I wanted to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today. Susan Macbeth, thanks for joining us as well. Donette, my friend from the Lowcountry Literary and Leisure Getaway, I'm so excited you're here on the app. Rebecca, thanks for joining us as well. Jonathan, we're at 1 hour. You know, what time flies so fast when anyone converses with you. You're an eloquent speaker. You know how to organize things. You know how to promote things. And the fact that you wrote and coordinated and edited Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy, is a phenomenal gift. And I just wanted you to have the last word tonight and any closing comments you want to share based on either Our Prince of Scribes or the work that the Pat Conroy Center is doing or anything you'd like to talk about at all. Let's just thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Susie, and I applaud your brave entrance here into Fireside and launching this new show. And I'm excited to hear Dana as well when her episode comes around. Dana's a phenomenal writer and an exceptionally skilled storyteller, and it's an honor to get to work with her at our Conroy Center. The center really has become a haven for literary activity in the Lowcountry, and it's absolutely an honor for us to do that in a place where there are just so many writers and so many invested readers. And now that the center is really accessible from anywhere by virtue of remote programming, we have not just a regional audience, not even just a national audience, but an international audience. And I encourage folks, if you're not already familiar with us, to have a look at our website, our Facebook page, and get a sense of who we are and what you might be able to participate in, regardless of where you are. And that too honors Pat Conroy in the same way that Our Prince of Scribes does, by celebrating something that Pat believed wholeheartedly in, and that's that the spotlight is always meant to be shared. It's never just for one person. It's never just for you. It's meant to be a teaching tool. Pat recognized that early on as he was on the path of becoming a famous person, that this was something that he could use to promote other people and other ideas and other causes that he believed wholeheartedly in. And that's what I see our role in the Conroy Center is as well, to not just let it be about Pat Conroy, but to always make sure that it's bigger than that, that it's an open invitation for folks to participate in. And with that said, I certainly appreciate the open invitation to participate in this show tonight, Susie. I've really enjoyed being a guest.
Absolutely. Thanks for helping guide me in that. I may have to have Susan Macbeth come up and tell me. I don't know how I'm going to end the show and I didn't want to because I forgot to say, yes, Jonathan, I would love to have you return. And I just look forward to all kinds of conversations. I'm going to have Susan come up and guide us. Hold on just a second. Susan is very involved on Fireside.
Hi,
And I think I
Susie.
got. Hey, does everyone know Susan Macbeth? Jonathan, do you know Susan, Dana, Donette?
No, I haven't
She
had the
has.
privilege of meeting them, but it's nice to meet you, and congratulations on your first show, Susie.
Thank you so much. Susan Macbeth has Adventures by the Book and the Novel Network, and we've interacted a time or two here on the app, and she's been involved from the very, very beginning. So,
Yeah,
what's
it's a
next
great
for you, Susan?
Oh, thank you. It's a great platform, and I'm glad to see you on it. Anytime we can connect people and communities through the power of books, I'm all for that. So, what do we have next? I don't know. We have so many things going on. I can't even keep track sometimes myself anymore. We've got a great trip to Rancho La Puerta, internationally renowned spa. We're going there for a week with New York Times bestselling authors Jane Green and Kate Quinn. We're doing a big Ukraine fundraising dinner we're based in San Diego, trying to raise funds for the International Rescue Committee to help these people of Ukraine who are suffering so greatly right now. And we've got like 35 authors committed to helping us with that. So lots of stuff going on.
That's fantastic. And one last thing I wanted to say, you have one of my previously featured authors that Jonathan and Dana and everybody knows as well. I think you're doing a tea in San Diego with Patty Callahan, isn't that right?
Yes, I adore her, and I can't wait. April 24th, anybody in the Southern California area, we're doing a literary tea. We do them quarterly at the Westgate Hotel in San Diego, and it's a really fun time. And any of you that are ever out that way, come see us, and maybe you can be our featured author.
Fantastic. And you have some lovely birds in the background. That's great. Jonathan, I am going to give you the last thank you. I'm having a hard time closing my show because I just want to stay. Thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight. Jonathan, you do have the final last word and in a second. And then do I put on the wait bot, Susan, and then I can close my show? I literally can't figure it out.
Yeah, no, you could just close it out when you're done. So, final words to your guest is a great way to close your show. And then just click the little button on the lower left corner and leave the show. And after you thank everyone.
Thank you for the guidance. Jonathan
Certainly.
Haupt. Jonathan Haupt, thank you so much for everything you helped us accomplish last week for the first annual Lowcountry Literary and Leisure Getaway. I really appreciate your leadership, your guidance, your mentoring of even me, someone in the travel industry trying to navigate the book world. And I want to thank Dana for saying she'll join us in a few weeks and the open ended invitation to Jonathan for participating. Any last comments, Jonathan? And I'll say goodnight after.
Thank you so much, Susie. I'm so glad to be a part of this partnership that we have and so proud of the work that you're doing in the Lowcountry in support of our Conroy Center and in support of books and authors and storytellers in general. It's just great to be a part of all of that as presenter and audience member and reader alike. Let me do this in closing. Let me read a very, very short paragraph from one final essay in Our Princess Scribe. This is from the writer Mark Powell, who's got a brand new book out, and it's a short but lovely passage. Reading Pat and later knowing him has been a life class, not only in how to write, but how to live, to be loyal, to be honest, to be kind, to love the South while refusing to accept its failings and shortcomings, to pay forward what cannot possibly be paid back, to write about your family, to love your family, to look directly in all the world's horror and face it honestly, but never to turn mean. That's what knowing Pat and reading Pat taught me and is teaching me still. A beautiful passage. And the idea of paying forward what cannot possibly be paid back is, I think, what brings us to the act of storytelling here tonight. So thank you again so much, Susie, and to everybody in the audience.
Thank you, everyone. And